Hello guys and welcome to another video, and in this one we're going to be taking a look at the Light Poacher unique helmet. This one drops exclusively from the bosses that you can find in the Abyssal Depths. That's the content that you can find from Abyss League. And in 3.21 this helmet was actually reworked a little bit. So how does this work? There's a modifier that grants +1 to maximum spirit charges per Abyss Jewel affecting you. So your spirit charge cap is based on how many Abyss Jewels are affecting you at any one time, which can be quite a considerable amount actually. This could be 2 from the helmet slot. This helmet in particular can grant up to 2 sockets. You can get 2 on the Tomb Fist or Command of the Pit unique gloves. And you can also get 2 on the Darkness Enthroned unique belt. Then there's the Bubonic Trail unique boots that can have up to 2. And the normal Shroud of the Lightless, which can have 2 or 3 abyssal sockets. There's also the replica version, which can have 6 sockets as well. And of course, you can also just socket Abyssal Jewels into your passive tree jewel slots. And you can also get Abyssal sockets on rare gear too. So you can have quite a lot of Abyssal Jewels affecting you at any one time. And that means that you will have a high maximum spirit charge count. Now the helmet has a few other things going on here too. You gain a spirit charge on kill. And you gain 5% of physical damage as extra damage of each element per spirit charge. So that's 15% of physical damage as extra damage per spirit charge, 5% as cold, 5% as lightning, and 5% as fire. And then it says, trigger level 20 spirit burst when you use a skill while you have a spirit charge. Now, the balance of this helmet is based around gaining and losing spirit charges. So you gain a spirit charge on kill, and then whenever you use a skill, you'll be triggering spirit burst, which consumes a spirit charge to deal damage. This is a trigger skill that doesn't have any cost associated with it, and it doesn't have a cooldown. But here's the thing, you don't really want to be triggering Spirit Burst unless your build is kind of built around that skill dealing damage, because it means that you'll lose a spirit charge, and as we've already mentioned, you gain a lot of extra damage. 15% actually per spirit charge as extra elemental damage. So what we want to do is have this buff up all the time without losing spirit charges, so that we can benefit from that extra damage whilst using another skill to deal damage. So there's actually a couple of ways that you can make it so you never trigger Spirit Burst, and you'll permanently keep all of your spirit charges, which means you can have potentially a huge amount of physical damage as extra elemental damage all the time. And I mean, it is kind of a crazy amount of damage. I've seen some builds with 20 plus Abyss Jewels. We're talking about 300% or more of physical damage as extra elemental damage. Not to mention that if you're using the Shroud of the Lightless body armor, which you likely will be with this type of setup, that's also a bunch of maximum life and mana and a huge amount of elemental penetration too. So how do you make it so you never trigger Spirit Burst? Well, there's a few methods. The first is by going Chaos Inoculation. See, this keystone will bring your maximum life down to 1 and make you immune to chaos damage. You can then socket Archmage into your helmet along with Life Tap, and this will cause the Spirit Burst skill first to have a mana cost, and then you'll transform that mana cost into a life cost. And since you can't pay the cost anymore, you'll be unable to trigger this skill, and that means that you'll be able to keep the charges that you gain from killing enemies. And if you want to take a look at that particular interaction, I'll put a link to Xantho's video on this particular interaction in the description of this video. This method is good, but it does require that you use Chaos Inoculation, which is quite build specific. You can do this method in a low life setup too, where you reserve enough life so that you can no longer pay the skills cost as well, but that option puts a lot of strain on your gear. So let's look at some other options. So what about if you force Spirit Burst to have a mana cost while you don't have the mana to pay for that cost? It's important to understand that Archmage's mana cost is based on unreserved maximum mana, so you can't reserve all of your mana to prevent it from triggering. But you can use some methods to deplete your mana so that you actually can't pay for that cost anymore. The first method is by using the Agnostic. This keystone sets your energy shield to 0 and sacrifices 20% of mana per second to recover that much life while you're not on full life. The thing is, unlike a life flask which stops at 100% of unreserved maximum life, this keystone will only stop at actual maximum life. And this means that by reserving some life, the keystone will constantly drain your mana to recover life. You can do this by linking a reservation skill to Arrogance, which will cause it to reserve life instead, and you can then use a level 1 Precision or Vitality to reserve a tiny amount of flat life. Once you have this setup, your mana is constantly being drained, and as long as you don't have enough mana recovery to sustain it, you'll always be on 0 mana. After this, you'll have a few options for paying your other skill costs. For example, you can gain a bunch of reduced cost modifiers, including things like Divergent Inspiration to reduce the cost of your main skill to 0. This is quite an expensive setup, but once you have it going, it means your main skill will cost nothing and it can be used completely freely, and you'll never trigger Spirit Burst because that still has a mana cost and you can't afford it. I'll put a link in the description to the build guide made by Maud. This is a really good guide which makes use of this particular interaction with the no mana cost main skill. And you can of course use life tap to pay your skill cost with your life instead, or you could use a skill that has a default life cost such as Reap or Exsanguinate or Rage Vortex. This is another great method to get around triggering Spirit Burst, but the Agnostic does cause you to lose all of your energy shield, which can be unfavourable. So let's take a look at another method. This one uses Righteous Fire combined with Mind Over Matter. So Mind Over Matter will cause 40% of damage taken to come from mana before life, and since Righteous Fire will constantly be dealing damage to your life, some of that damage will be taken from mana, which will have a similar effect as the Agnostic where your mana is constantly being depleted, so it's always on 0. You do need to be able to sustain Righteous Fire with this setup though, but this will give you a nice additional boost to your spell damage as well. And you can use this on an Inquisitor so that you can still make use of your energy shield as well, as long as you're also using Corrupted Soul. And you can get that from the Glorious Vanity Timeless Jewel in the name of Doryani, or from a replica Soul Tether Belt. Waggle actually did this on his Inquisitor, so I'll link his character profile in the description below and you can take a look at the setup that he's running. This method is another great way to get around triggering Spirit Burst, with the downside of this one being that you need to have a build that can actually sustain Righteous Fire to make it work. And what about this method right here? You can use Blood Rage with Mind Over Matter so that the physical damage over time that's applied from Blood Rage is constantly draining your mana. This is a decent alternative to the RF method if you can't sustain Righteous Fire, but Blood Rage will deplete your energy shield first. You can use the 4th Vow that has the modifier where physical damage bypasses energy shield, but you'll likely be wanting to use Divine Flesh with the 4th Vow, which makes all damage bypass energy shield anyway. And so you can solve the triggering of Spirit Burst in quite a few ways so you never lose Spirit Charges, but what about gaining them? You gain a Spirit Charge on kill, but that's not very useful for some bosses. That's where the Writhing Jar unique hybrid flask comes in. This flask spawns some writhing worms, and these worms can be killed to gain Spirit Charges. The great thing about this flask though is that it's a hybrid flask, so it counts as a life and mana flask for the purpose of modifiers that grant charges to life and mana flasks. So the Replenishing Remedies wheel on the passive tree, that's this one right here just above the Ranger start area, along with the Mastery that grants life and mana flasks 1 charge every 3 seconds, this will grant you a total of 8 charges every 3 seconds. And with no additional flask charge gain modifiers, that means that you can use this flask every 6 seconds to gain 2 more spirit charges. So you can easily prep maximum spirit charges before a boss fight, and that's some great tech there to be able to use this helmet for massive damage even in boss arenas. And what about skill usage? Well, you can make use of anything that deals physical damage really. A lot of people have been using this with Ethereal Knives. I've seen some Reap and Exsanguinate builds. You can use Blade Vortex or Bladeful Blade Blast. You could even use something like Hydrosphere. You can use some attack skills too. I've talked about Rage Vortex earlier. You can get very creative here, which is what makes this such a fun unique. And there it is. A really great use of this helmet to gain massive amounts of damage. Player ingenuity wins again. I really love the clever use of mechanics to solve this helmet. I hope that this doesn't get changed in the future because I think this has some really cool interactions. What do you guys think about this? Have you been using this helmet in your build? Let me know what type of build you're using with it. And that's it for this one, guys. Thank you for watching. And as always, stay tuned and stay safe.